Hello everyone and welcome to Quality Old Games. Today we are making another tier list, this time from Portuguese unit roster in Medieval 2 Total War, and this tier list is based on campaign setting, and additionally the series how good is a given unit plays an important role in the testing. And so the unit's fighting capabilities, but also the cost and requirements and upkeep are taken into consideration in this tier list. But without further ado, let's begin. First we have General's Bodyguard, and of course early game really superior unit. I think the main downsides are practically the relatively small unit size, and furthermore you cannot train these guys. So you are kind of relying on getting new family members and thus getting these units more and more. So because of those weaknesses, I think they deserve a place in really strong good tier, or perhaps on the weaker side of the superior tier, but I think we will leave them at the head of the good tier for now. Then we have Conquistadores. I mean, stats-wise and in combat, these guys are just one of the finest cavalry units in the entire game. But then we have the downsides, which are really bad, because you can only train these units in the New World. So basically, if you want to really benefit from them, you need to ship them back into the Old World, and that makes them really an endgame unit, and severely limits their usability. So, I mean, if you could train them, I would rate them most definitely here in the good tier, at the very least. But with the unit constraints, I don't think it's don't make, but practically you cannot make. So, yeah, a really good unit. A bit of a shame that you cannot utilize them too much. So, yeah, I'm going to give them don't make tier. Then we have Feudal Knights. I mean, solid cavalry unit available in relatively early game. It's a good unit. Practically, cavalry is relatively king in this game. So, early game, good cavalry unit. I mean, you will be using most likely these guys through the entire game. So, a really solid unit. Practically for every faction that has it. Then we have Jinetes, and they are kind of unique unit for Portugal and Spain, and well, they are the earliest cavalry unit, or among the earliest cavalry units that Portugal can get, and as they are missile cavalry with relatively decent melee stats, I think they deserve a place in superior position. I mean, high mobility, missiles, they can outrun chasing cavalry, they can easily take out heavy infantry, they can rush enemy missile units. So practically the only hard counter for these units is another missile cavalry unit which has longer range. So basically crossbow cavalry units, and perhaps some archer cavalry units, but yeah, I mean, really solid unit. Practically you can win the entire campaign with only Jinetes, in my opinion. Well, perhaps you might need some infantry to man the battering rams and so on, and keep up public order, but overall, in fighting armies, Jinetes can beat the entire campaign. Then we have Knights of Santiago, kind of equal to Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller. I mean, relatively decent unit, perhaps in battle a bit better than Feudal Knights, but the availability might be a bit more difficult for these guys, so that's the reason they get a place after Feudal Knights. Then we have Mailed Knights. I mean, another early game heavy cavalry unit, relatively decent throughout the entire campaign. Of course, Feudal Knights perform a bit better in battle, but these guys are more readily available and a bit cheaper as well. So I think they deserve a solid place in good tier as well. And then we have Merchant Cavalry Militia. This is kind of the Western European variant, which is not actually that good, in my opinion. So, I mean, there are some situations, because you get free upkeep units in cities, some of these. So that's really nice, but in battle they are not really that good, despite cavalry always having the speed advantage, but still. I mean, in my opinion, they are relatively bad. You feel free to disagree if you want, but in my opinion, they are rather bad. Then we have these mounted crossbowmen, and well, they can counter Ginets, but and they can counter practically everything in the game. Perhaps some heaviest crossbowmen might cause them some trouble, but in any case, their only drawback is that the requirements are really high, and the unit is a bit on the pricier side. So I think because of those drawbacks, it's not as good as Ginets, but still deserves a place clearly in the superior unit tier. And then we have Portuguese Knights. I mean, yeah, solid enough unit. Of course, they do relatively well in battle, but they are clearly a late game unit, but they don't do that much better in battle than those early game cavalry units. So, I mean, they are kind of obsolete in my opinion. Why to build those highest tier cavalry stables if you can do with just the basic castle, citadel, fortress buildings? And because of that, I will give them place only in bad tier. The unit is bad, not bad per se, and of course if you can, for instance, conquer a castle or citadel which has the requirements already met for these guys, then by all means train them. But I mean, it's wasted money, in my opinion, if you build that construction chain specifically to get these units. Because with that money and time you could get several of these guys, and well, in my opinion, that's an advantage. Then let's move to infantry units. First we have Portuguese specialty, Aventuros. I don't know how to pronounce that. I hope that went close enough. And I mean, they are one of the strongest pike units in the entire game. I mean, long spears, rather heavily armored, so they can hold their own in almost any situations. Of course, as all spear units or pike units, they are relatively vulnerable to missiles, so that's clearly a weakness, but overall, especially in defensive mode, they don't suffer too many casualties, and they can just keep the enemy at bay. So you can flank with cavalry or hit them with the missiles or something like that. Of course, if you use them, then put 2 units on top of each other so that they don't actually break the ranks too soon. So based on these, I think, and based on the test results, I think these guys deserve a place in good tier and in the higher end of the good tier. Then we have dismounted conquistadores. I mean, once again, the unit is perhaps one of the finest heavy infantry units in the game, but the requirements, you need to be in New World to recruit them. So once again, the same as with the conquistadores, the unit is kind of obsolete. I mean, yeah, it's good infantry, but practically you cannot really make it, so yeah, that's the reason why it gets to don't make. Perhaps I should switch the name here, you cannot make, or something like that, because it's both of these are kind of niche units in the kind of big picture of the campaign. And dismounted conquistadores, once again, a really, really good unit in battle, but the requirements. Then let's move to dismounted feudal knights. I mean, really solid heavy infantry, but unfortunately, heavy infantry, in my opinion, in this game is relatively situational. So they can shine in siege battles, be it offensive or defensive, but in open fields, kind of cavalry often wrecks them. So even though they are a really solid unit, the problems in the open field, kind of limits their usefulness. And because of that, they get a place in the weaker end of good tier. Then we have dismounted Portuguese knights. This unit is kind of interesting one, because quite often units with two-handed weapons perform quite poorly in the game, but this is one exception for that rule. They can survive relatively well, and with those two-handed weapons they can lash out quite a bit of punishment against almost every foe. Of course they are vulnerable to missiles, so there is that, but still, I mean, relatively good unit, even though on the weaker side of good tier. Then we have peasants. I've said it before, I like peasants really much in Rome Total War. I don't like peasants at all in Medieval 2 Total War. I mean, there are some really limited cases where one might want to have peasants, perhaps in some public order situations, but then you need to train them in castles and then move into cities, which might be problematic in some cases. And furthermore, in some situations where you cannot recruit anything else, but you just need to have troops, for instance to man the walls, then peasants can kind of man the towers and the towers can do the killing, and well, then peasants can be useful. But in the open field battles and so on and so forth, no. I think don't make. If you cannot avoid it, then make, but otherwise, no, in my opinion. Then we have pike militia. I mean, compared to the Aventuros, they are not nearly as good, but they are relatively easy to get. The upkeep can be mitigated if they are garrisoned in cities, and they can hold the line relatively well, especially against infantry and cavalry. So, especially in defensive battles, these guys can do relatively well. So I think they deserve a place in moderate tier. Then we have swordsman militia. Kind of one of the best militia units in some situations. I mean, pike militia is clearly a defensive militia unit, but this can be used offensively as well. Stats are rather great, they are not that far behind, for instance, dismounted feudal knights, and of course then there is that free upkeep option as well in settlements. But, so I think, yeah, they are moderate units, they are not that good in battle, but then again the requirements are not that high either. Then we have spear militia. Once again, militia units, free upkeep, that's great. Spear militia, well, you can expect them to hold the line for a while against infantry, and of course their main task is to counter enemy cavalry, and in that they are decent enough. Well, you can kind of expect that one unit of spear militias can negate one enemy heavy cavalry unit, and that's nice. Then again, you have to be prepared that you cannot practically use that individual spear militia unit in the next battle. So it needs retraining or you need a new one to replace it. So it can trade and trade rather well against cavalry, but it will suffer losses. Overall, I think despite it's good against cavalry, it's not that good against anything else. So I think I will give it bad tier. Then we have town militia. Actually a bit weaker variant, in my opinion, from spear militia, because, well, they cannot counter cavalry as well as that spear militia can. So that's really going against them, and then they are not that much better against anything else that spear militia struggles against. So perhaps some infantry, they can fight a bit better than spear militia, but they don't do that really well. So I think these guys also unfortunately don't make tier. Perhaps the situation is a bit same as with peasants. In the early game especially, you might need to make these to fill the gaps in the garrison or to keep up the public order or so on and so forth. But the battle performance is rather abysmal, in my opinion. Then we have Amulkava's missile unit, and in my opinion, missile units alone are just painful to control. So alone, javelin units are a pain to control, and alone just don't use javelin units, or javelin infantry. But if you can get infantry screen in front of these, or if you can get these guys to the walls, then they certainly can have their uses, as they are quite good at piercing enemy armor. So I think I will give them a place in bad tier or moderate tier. Actually, the tests controlling these were so painful that because of that I will give them place only in bad tier. Then we have crossbow militia, one of the earliest crossbow units, and if you take into consideration the requirements, cost and upkeep, and how much they have punching power, even against, for instance, dismounted feudal knights, most heavily armored cavalry and so on. I mean, that's just absurd, and because of that, I think they deserve a place in good tier, most definitely, and in the highest end of good tier, because these units are viable through the entire campaign, and you can get them really early. So, a really useful unit, especially considering its cost. Then we have handgunners. As I have said in other videos, gunpowder units are relatively niche, at least for me. They are late game units, and then the earliest gunpowder units are kind of inaccurate, have short range, and you need to kind of know how to use them so that they will be firing by the rank and so on and so forth. And you cannot have infantry in front of them, so you need to be kind of prepared to micro them if enemy is going to get at them. So in my opinion, that intensity in a micro kind of decreases their usability. So quite often I would take some crossbow unit, for instance Pavis crossbow unit, over gunpowder unit, because that makes battles a bit easier. You can just leave crossbows at fire at will behind the infantry, even though they are not that efficient. And if you can spare the micro, you can use them to circle around the enemy, so you can shoot at the flanks and so on. But with gunpowder units, that's not really that easy. And of course, you cannot man the defenses that well with them, at least in my experience. So, yeah, I think they are moderate, because they are kind of frightening, but on the lower end of moderate. Then we have Lusitanian Javelin men. Yeah, another Javelin infantry, pain to control. They are a bit cheaper than Amulkavas and do a bit worse in battle, and I guess they get a bit worse place in the tier list. So bad unit, and really annoying to micro. Of course, once again, if you have infantry in front of them, that's nice. If you have walls in which you can place them, then nice. But otherwise, I don't like them. Then we have musketeers. I mean, pretty much the same applies as to those handgunners. They are a bit stronger, so let's put them in front of those handgunners in the moderate tier, and of course they have longer range. That's really nice, and of course with gunpowder units they have that high armor piercing value, so they do really pack a punch. But then again, yeah, I think the same problems apply to them as to the handgunners. Then we have Pavis crossbowmen. I mean, they do rather well in battle, better than crossbow militia, but the requirements are quite a bit higher for them, and thus they get a place somewhere in the middle of the good tier, in my opinion. Of course, the survivability is better, so for instance in an offensive army, if you are going on a campaign against enemies and you need to keep going, you cannot replenish units and so on and so forth, then perhaps I would take Pavis crossbowmen, but in defensive battles, most definitely crossbow militia, mostly because it's cheaper, especially cheaper to maintain, and it's easier to replenish, most likely. So that's the reason why these guys get a bit worse ranking, even though they do better in battles. Then we have peasant archers. Yeah, archers can do relatively well, but at the same time, in my opinion, they are a bit obsolete. Why to make archers that don't have armor piercing if you can quite soon make crossbows that do have armor piercing? So yeah, they might fire a bit faster, and they can fire flaming ammo, that's nice, but overall I think crossbows are so much better than archers in many situations. Okay, excluding longbowmen and their variants, but overall, at least I prefer crossbowmen in the campaign. And speaking of crossbowmen, we have peasant crossbowmen, rather similar to those crossbow militias, perhaps a bit higher stats, but you cannot get free upkeep for these guys, so they get a bit lower place in the good tier, even though they are clearly on the upper end of good tier. And then we have Portuguese arquebusiers, I mean kind of middle unit between musketeers and handgunners, and well, they are gunpowder firearm units. That says pretty much everything. If Portugal had just arquebusiers, these guys would be better than them, but I mean, yeah, I don't like too much gunpowder units. Once again, a bit of a niche, and my campaigns at least tend to be over before I can really get access to the higher end gunpowder units. Then we have artillery units. First we have ballista. Regarding all of the artillery units, what I don't like is that they slow down armies, but in some situations they can be useful. And ballista, I mean, you can use it to snipe some high value units, that's nice, but overall I think that their damage output, even against enemy units, is relatively weak, and because of that I will give them place only in C tier. I mean, perhaps it might even have to go to don't make tier, but it can have some uses. But yeah, nothing to really write home about. Then we have Basilisk, kind of the best cannon unit in the entire game. That's nice. I mean, in field battles quite often, in my opinion, they just take space. And of course you can hit enemies and force them to come to you. That's also nice. But overall, how much they deal damage, in my experience, they don't do that quite enough. And furthermore, they are clearly a late game unit, so their availability in a campaign might be an issue as well. But of course, if enemy has a citadel with cannon towers, then these guys will be your answer to that, and they can just smash anything in their way, and you can conquer that citadel. Then we have Bombard, the earliest cannon unit and easiest to get. I think it actually deserves a place a bit higher than Basilisk because of the easiness of availability, and quite often these bombards will be quite enough in the siege battles to knock down the towers and walls you want to be knocked down. So yeah, I think in the higher end of moderate tier. And then we have my favorite siege unit, Catapult, and well, it's available early in the game, and furthermore in battles the catapult ammo trajectory is such that it can deal quite nice amounts of damage, and in my experience it's relatively accurate. Of course not that really accurate unit type, but kind of accurate enough, especially with stones, and of course flaming ammo can do some nice damage, especially against clumped enemies, so I think catapult from me will get a place in good tier. That's the kind of exception siege unit for me. And of course, especially regarding wooden palisades, perhaps to some degree stone walls. You can even knock down some towers and walls with these units. Of course, they are not on their own against those largest stone walls or defensive structures, but I think they can do enough in those situations as well. Then we have Cavalry, kind of a bit lower tier unit than Basilisk. Yeah, same things goes for these as for Basilisks. Perhaps they are a bit weaker powered than Basilisk, so a bit lower tier for them. Then we have Grand Bombard, kind of upgraded Bombard. I don't think the upgrade is that valuable, so that the kind of the benefits will outperform the costs in this case. So I think it's relatively bad unit. Then we have Revolt, rather interesting units. Or unit they can inflict rather nice damage when they get to fire, and of course there are quite long periods when they are not firing as they are loading. So that kind of limits its usability. If it were able to reload faster, I think it would be in good tier, but as it is, it goes somewhere here in the moderate tier. And then we have Trebuchet, the early game answer to heavy defenses. So in field battles, in my opinion, not really useful. Knocking down walls, nice, and I don't think they do that well knocking down enemy soldiers in siege battles. So yeah, I think I will give them place in moderate tier somewhere around here. So this is my view of the Portuguese unit roster in campaign setting. Do you agree or disagree? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and this template is also available in Tier Maker. I guess it was Portuguese unit roster in Medieval 2 Total War, if you want to check it out or make your own tier list. And if you liked the video, please leave a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Have a great rest of the day. Quality Old Games out.